the next Caparica talk of this conference, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you Professor Jianhua Wang, if I may, because I think Professor Wang is very well known in the analytical community, so I think we do not need any extra presentation. And he's going to talk to us about the selective absorption of specific proteins with polyoxometalase as absorption medium, and this is very important because many single proteins can give us many ideas about diagnosis and prognosis. So thank you very much, Professor Wang, for accepting to be here today.
Thank you, Professor Capello. I appreciate very much for inviting me to be a part of this very nice conference. And my talk today will be selective adsorption of specific proteins with polyoxymetylate as adsorption medium. This will include 3 parts. After a very short description of the background, I will give you 2 examples to show the interactions between polyoxymetylase with the protein for protein adsorption, and followed by some conclusion remarks. Now, first, the background. We know that in proteomic analysis, people always run into problems due to the fact that, on one hand, the biological sample matrix is generally very complex, so that in this case, it will very often cause interferences for the identification of proteins, especially for very low abundance of proteins. And on the other hand, the protein concentration in biological samples generally has a very wide concentration range. It can be up to the magnitude of 10 to the 12 power. So in this case, the very high concentration of protein, that is high abundant protein, will cause interference for that identification of low abundance of proteins, so will cause a low coverage for low abundant proteins. So in addition to the sensitivity limitation of the currently available mass spectrometric technique for protein identification, so this issue is even more challenging. So in this respect, it's very important to do sample pretreatment for protein isolation and adsorption. So in this case, we can either separate or pre-concentrate the low abundant protein. We can also eliminate the high abundance of proteins. So the key for this issue is, of course, the adsorbance. So we can play with the spatial structure, and also we can regulate the surface property of that adsorbance in order to achieve selective or specific isolation for some kind of specific proteins or proteomides. So adsorbent is also very important. During the last years, we have tried a lot and paid a lot of effort to check different adsorbents. So except for conventional adsorbents, we also tried a lot of things to focus on carbon nanostructures, for example, carbon nanotubes, graphene, and also graphene composite, and some other things. And we also paid attention to ionic liquids as a absorption medium. I can see some guys, they also mentioned ionic liquids in this conference. And today I will show you that polyoxometalate, simply as shorted as POMS, is also a very promising candidate for protein isolation and pre-concentration. So we know POMS are generally polyanions with 3 or more transition metal oxyanions linked together by oxygen atoms to form closed 3D structures. As I showed here, we actually have many different kinds of POMS units. So this gives us a very wide range of choice to develop new adsorbents for protein adsorption. So protein and POMS interaction, of course, give us a mere opportunity to achieve protein recognition and in some specific conditions to adsorb specific proteins from complex biological sample matrix. For example, I show you here many different POM structures. They can interact with some special domains in protein structures to show different interactions, and also here. So the interaction can be hydrogen bonding, can be covalent interaction, and some other things, and also can be electrostatic interactions. So generally, POMs has various kinds of transition metals, and also they are rich in oxygen. So it provides various interactions. So this allowed us to use, for example, the pore structure of the POMs, and also POMs are generally very stable with a very wide pH range, so that they are strongly reactive to electrophilic metals. So the POM and the protein interactions, generally we can use metal affinity, surface charge, and also spatial structure. The porous structure of a POM can provide us a recognition site for protein with different conformations. And also, we can regulate the surface properties of the materials in order to reduce no specific interactions. So during the last years, we have spent some time to do this kind of research work in order to either deplete high abundant proteins or to pre-concentrate or enrichment of low abundant proteins. And our work has also been published in some different places. So now I will go to show you two examples in order to show the POMs and protein interactions for protein adsorption. The first example is octamolidate and a metal organic framework composite for selective adsorption of histine-rich proteins. Octamolidate is actually, this is a cluster with many different isomers. And these isomers are generally, they can have a different size, different shapes. They can provide multiple cognition sites or binding sites for protein interaction. So the problem is that POMs are generally water soluble. So they are very good to interact with protein, but for the purpose of solid phase extraction, it's not very easy to handle. So it's very important to some kind of immobilize the POM unit onto the surface, some kind of a solid support. So in our case, we chose a very simple metal framework, a metal organic framework, that is MIL101. This is actually a very simple mesoporous chromium pterofacilate. They have contains pores and pore windows with different sizes. For example, can be 12, 16, 29, and 34 esters. So this actually provides accessible species for different kind of POMs, so that it also gives us an opportunity to develop different kinds of POMs and morphs hybrid in order to perform solid phase extraction for proteins, and of course also for other kind of analyze. So in our case, the incorporation of this POM unit into the POM structure can be very easily. We can see actually it can be through size effect and also through electrostatic interaction to form this octamolidate and POM composite. And so in this composite, it can provide two kinds of binding sites. The first is N-terminal site and also a metal binding site. For actually, in this case, it's very good for histine-rich protein. So now we chose some kind of 6 different proteins with histine, different numbers of histine. We can see that the POM itself actually has some kind of adsorption for all the proteins, and this is no specific adsorption. And after we used this composite, we can see that 3 of them, HSA, TRF, and IgG, their adsorption capacities actually have been very largely improved. So this is actually related to the special domains in histone-rich proteins that I said. The first is N-terminal site, composed of aspartic acid, alanine, and also histone. And also there is a metal binding site. So we can see that actually the first three proteins for HSA, it has both N-terminal and also metal binding site. And afterwards, these two, they have a metal binding site. So that in this case, these three proteins, their adsorption capacities are much higher than the others. So this is actually the properties at pH 5. So if we play with the pH, that is, we change the pH to other values, actually this binding site, they can be changed. For example, if we change pH from 5 to 9, so we can see that for HSA, both binding sites are lost. And for transferrin, the metal binding site is lost. Only for IgG, the metal binding sites are still there. So we can see that the other proteins, the adsorption capacity reduced to normal level. And only this IgG, it still remains very high adsorption capacity. So this material is actually very useful for the depletion of high abundant histone-rich proteins. So we can see that the first example is that we have a synthetic sample with HSA, IgG, pepsin, and HRP at a concentration level of 10 1. We can see that at first we can only, the original synthetic sample, we can only get HSA. And the other low abundant proteins are completely suppressed. And after the depletion of histone-rich protein HSA, we can see that other low abundance proteins are well identified. We can also see that if we use plasma, we can very efficiently deplete the histone-rich protein, that HSA and IgG. And also these proteins can be very easily collected afterwards. So when we see the 2D page of this plasma, we can see that HSA and IgG have a very, very high concentration, so that we can see that the low abundant proteins are not seen at all. So after the depletion of these high abundant proteins, we can see that many of the low abundant proteins are very well identified. So we can see that at the very beginning, the original plasma actually it contains something like 50% of albumin. So in this case, the other low abundance proteins are only very badly identified. After we get rid of most part of the albumin, we can see that other low abundant proteins are very well identified. So now I'll go to the second example, that is polyoxyvanadate bioconjugate for the selective isolation of mucin subfragment 1, that is S1 unit. This is actually connected with the problem of heart failure. As we know that in systolic heart failure, generally the ventricle muscle wall, the extraction force is weak in this case, so that generally they pump less blood into the circulation. That in that case we have a heart problem. So in this case, mucin is a motor protein for the heart muscle. It generally has two double-headed structure subfragment. That is a SY fragment, and also it has a long flexible coiled tail rod. In this case, this SY unit and mucin, they are actually involved in the modulation of muscle contraction and also involved in other motility processes. So the SY unit, they have the motor domain in this SY subunit is ATP binding and actin binding. So in this case, it's very important to study the isomers and mutation of moisten. So this it will help to elucidate the mechanisms of the heart failure process. So that it's very important to isolate moisten SY unit from a very complex biological sample matrix. So in our case, we still think about a POM in this case. So we think about Deacon Vanadate. This is another kind of a POM unit. It can be, after protonation, it can be interacted with proteins and enzyme, and in that case, it can inhibit the enzyme activity. For example, we can see here, when we are looking for the interaction between Deacon Vanadate and this nucleotide diphosphatase, we can see that actually this POM unit, they can combine with a domain here composed with an N-terminal loop and also 3 amino acid here, arginine and 2 lysines. We can also see actually in the SY unit in this case, it has a ATP binding site and also a phosphate binding loop, that is a P loop. So in order to perform solid phase extraction, we still need to immobilize this POM unit into a certain kind of solid support. So in this case, we, after a very simple reaction by linking with a DNA fragment and afterwards combined with biotin, and then we combine this unit with magnetic particles to construct composite particle here. So we used this particle to investigate the adsorption of a certain kind of proteins. We can see that we chose the 5 proteins here, including moisten and some others. We started it within a wide range of pH values and also within a wide range of ionic strength. We can see that in both cases at pH 4 to 10 and also with ionic strength in terms of sodium chloride concentration of less than 500 millimolar, we get very good selectivity for moisten with respect to other proteins. Also, we can see that actually we can use very diluted SDS solution in order to recover the adsorbed moisten. We also have started that after stripping off the SDS, the structural protein can be recovered and the activity of the proteins will be not changed. So now I would like to see the binding activity of this POM composite to the SY unit. It's actually that the ATP binding here, including a beta sheet, alpha helix, and then beta sheet, and also a P loop. And these 2 binding sites actually have a very high interaction, very high binding capacity with vanadate. And also we see that actually the binding in this case is something like a sheep complementary, so that it further improves the selectivity of the binding. So afterwards, we have tried this to the moisten by alpha chromotropin digestion. We can get the moisten here. And also we have tried a real biological sample, that is porcine heart. We first extract protein from porcine heart. It's subject to first extraction, and afterwards we digest the obtained moisten, and then it's subject to the second extraction, followed by Moditov mass spectrometric study. We can see that the moisten is very well collected and also SY subunit. And afterwards, the Moditov identification tell us that we actually get the SY subunit from the moisten 2 isomer with a molecular weight of here and a PI value of 8.67. And also the sequence is located in this 1842 in the sequence of moisten. And also we get amino sequence coverage of 38. So now I'll go to the conclusion remarks. As we see that the POMs has various spatial structures, and also they have very abundant binding sites. So this gives us very good blocks for developing various functional materials for protein adsorption and isolation. And also spatial domains in proteins lead to their selectivity for interacting with POMs or their derivatives. So finally, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. Are you planning to adapt this kind of technology to point-of-care devices? Because, for instance, the physicians like to have quick access to this kind of devices to just to learn, to know if people getting in the emergencies are having a heart attack, a brain attack, or any other kind of punctual pain. So the question is, can this be used in that sense?
Actually, I should say that I don't know. Actually, we are just provided this kind of method in order to isolate specific proteins, and we are unable to study further, because I think your question is very outside my knowledge sphere. So,
okay.
Sorry.
we have time for more questions if you have. Yes.
Well, I'm Lorena from University of Alicante. First, thanks for your nice talk and interesting material. My question is, have you tried to immobilize these POMs in another nanomaterials that have been not shown in the presentation, like silica particles or zeolites or other kind of materials?
Thank you for the question. Actually, here I just show you two examples for this kind of studies. And as I told you that during the last few years, we have spent a lot of time and also a lot of efforts in order to study the interactions between the proteins and the POMs. And of course, we have immobilized different kinds of POM units onto different kinds of solid supports. For example, you mentioned the silica and some other solid supports. And in that case, they provide different selectivities for different protein species. So, yeah.
And which of these other materials have worked better for, or it depends on different applications, I suppose?
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, different POM units that provide different selectivities for different proteins. So, yeah.
So, if there is no more questions, okay. We thank Professor Wang for this nice talk, and we'll go to the coffee break.
Thank you.
Thank you.